with a person that's doing some phenomenal work around open data and humanitarian issues, who I'm going to pass off to Victoria to introduce, given their connections in the past. So we'll have about a 15 or so minute presentation, conversation, and then we'll break so that we can do regular projects for those who want to, and we'll have a brainstorm for people who are interested in thinking through some of the potential open data, resiliency, preparedness, disaster issues. Not that those are ever going to happen here, right? So, Victoria.
Great to meet you all, and like Spike was saying, I just joined last month as the Chief Resiliency Officer for Oakland. I'm new to the area. I've just moved from Washington, D.C., where I was working previously at the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, which focuses on helping countries around the world. And before that, I was at FEMA, where I worked with a lot of communities after disasters to recover. And so I'm really excited to be in Oakland before a disaster to work with all of you on making our city more resilient. And what I wanted to do to just kind of kick off the conversation before turning it over to John is speak a little bit about what we mean when we talk about resilience and a resilient city, so that because there's so many different definitions out there. In the academic world, they can have hour-long, multiple day-long debates about what it means. And so I just wanted to frame that discussion for us a little bit. So just like to start off, we're one of 32 cities so far that is part of this Rockefeller-funded 100 Resilient Cities Network. Our neighbor, San Francisco and Berkeley, also just got Chief Resilience Officers, but it's cities around the world. It's from Durban, South Africa, and Medellin, Colombia, to Surat, India. So we're really going to have this opportunity as Oakland, both to focus on what matters for us, but also connect with peers in cities who are engaged in the same struggle and effort. So what is urban resilience? It's pretty comprehensive. It looks at our individuals, businesses, institutions, city systems, and looks at building both the ability to survive any shocks and stresses we might face, but also really importantly, adapt. And our world is changing so much, so rapidly, and perhaps it was always changing rapidly, but it seems to just be accelerating, that whether it's climate change and sea level rise, which our infrastructure was built not taking that into account, or it's social changes and demographic changes due to housing prices going up, we're success of cities and their ability to grow will really depend on how nimble we are. Can we turn left? Can we turn right? Is part of the way we do business, the way our communities are developing. And that's just an approach, and it has to be kind of embedded in what we're doing. So surviving, adapting, and growing at the individual level, at the community-wide level, institutions. The other part is what are the shocks and stresses that we deal with? Here in Oakland, it's kind of hard to see probably from the back of the room, but the stresses, pretty much all of them exist in Oakland. From the drought we're experiencing right now, water scarcity, to crime and violence, to changing demographic pressures, poverty and inequity, aging infrastructure that really needs a lot more investment. Those are all stresses that we face here in Oakland. On the shock side, there's the obvious ones. Hayward is way overdue. So we're definitely in our lifetime going to have another major earthquake. We're also, we have wildfires here. We're going to see more flooding as we see more sea level rise. The only ones on the list of shocks that we probably don't need to worry about are severe cold, extreme cold, and dust storms. Those are probably the two that we thankfully, unless there's some severe climate change, we won't be worrying about those. But everything else, to some extent, are things that are part of the challenges that we in Oakland can potentially face. So the question becomes, if we want to keep developing, we want to keep growing and thriving, how do we do so in a way that addresses these shocks and stresses? So that's the challenge on the table for us as we think about how to make Oakland more resilient. I have a handout that I can pass out because it's too small to see, but really when we think about kind of all the aspects of resilience, it's pretty comprehensive, and I'll just let you pass those out this way. We're looking at, and this diagram here, which is the city resilience framework that Rockefeller is using, is based on a lot of case studies of cities around the world and what were the drivers, really exploring the question of what drove community and urban resilience. And they distilled it down to basically 12 factors that really make a difference. And as you look at the wheel of resilience, as I call it, which basically looks like a wheel, there's 4 dimensions. It's everything from strong leadership and a strategy. It's the health and well-being of the community, a vibrant economy and society, and taking into account both the infrastructure and the environment. And so as you look around this wheel, it covers so much, from meeting basic needs, supporting livelihoods and employment, on the health and well-being side, to fostering economic prosperity. These are all things that when we think about community development are critical ingredients, or even infrastructure in the environment. It includes ensuring continuity of critical services, or making sure that we're providing reliable communications and mobility. And on the leadership side, empowering people, fostering long-term planning, and promoting leadership and effective management. So it's a pretty comprehensive approach. And so one of the things that we'll be trying to do here in Oakland is, initially as part of this resilience planning effort, starting looking at the shocks and stresses. We've got so many, so where do we prioritize? What are the ones that are most likely to affect us in the most grave way? And have that discussion. Then we'll be looking at the resilience framework and figuring out, well, how resilient are we today? What's the baseline? Where do we need to focus more of our efforts and energy? And we'll be looking at mapping existing efforts and initiatives to get that better sense of where are we strong, where do we need to focus, who's doing what. That'll help us then do a gap analysis and figure out where do we need to do more. And then the main deliverable from the resilience planning process will be an action plan that really helps the city and all of its partners prioritize our focus going forward to make sure that we're all contributing to a resilient Oakland. And so it's a pretty intensive effort over the next 2 to 3 years to really take the step back and be strategic about how, whether you're working on health issues, housing issues, economic issues, how all these things actually come together and focus on building those drivers of a resilient city. And one of the things that I learned working at GFDRR, where I was before at the World Bank, was that one of the catalysts for doing this type of work is really, can really come out of people working on open data, working on crowdsourcing mapping, that really getting people involved in analyzing shocks and stresses and how to do things has really shaped the way so many communities are making themselves more resilient. And so when John Crowley, who I worked with at the World Bank, mentioned that he was going to be in town for a conference, I said, come to Oakland, please, and let's talk about this with OpenOakland, because I'd heard so many great things about the work you all have been engaged in. And the application of open data to this challenge was something that I thought would be really interesting for us to brainstorm together and kind of see what we might want to do together over the next couple of years, building on some of the work that's already been done, such as the Soft Story app, which has made a lot of ripples out there and is really helping get attention on the issue of making housing safer and apartment buildings safer. So that's a little bit on resilience, big picture. Any questions or thoughts before I introduce John?
So I didn't see epidemics on the list of stresses. I just given
it definitely,
the
yeah,
issue.
it definitely is one of them. So this was just a generalized list, not a comprehensive list, but yeah, it's definitely among them. And depending on how bad it is, it could be a shock, for sure.
Is there some kind of, I don't know, existing list of how, since there's so many things to keep in mind, how are they prioritized since there aren't a lot of resources?
So that's one of the things we'll be doing as Oakland, is having to prioritize. And that's where even having data and having even risk modeling about what's the probability of certain things or what's the impact of certain stressors on the overall community, that kind of thing will help us hone in on what shocks and stresses do we need to tackle first. Because you're right, we won't have resources for everything. Yeah, so we'll be doing that kind of work together. All right, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Crowley. Currently works at the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, where I was previously, and has worked both in the U.S. And internationally on these types of issues for a really long time. Also has done innovative work with all kinds of organizations, from, in this area, the postnatal graduate school on figuring out how he was telling me today how you can use the ships to help in emergency situations here in the Bay, to helping different countries with crowdsourcing various maps that will really help them innovate and prepare for disasters. Your list of accomplishments is very, did you pass around his bio? It's very long.
Short version.
But,
Short version, please.
Short version.
My 3-word version's best.
In addition, he is an amazing cellist. But thank you so much for making the time to come join us, and I'll pass it over to you.
Absolutely. It's good to be here. I spend a fair amount of time working on open data, open source, and trying. Sure. A lot of the work I do is trying to figure out how do we get data out. A lot of governments have it. It's fragmented, it's siloed, it's proprietary. Getting it into the hands of developers so that you can do stuff with it, turn it into analysis, turn it into advocacy, turn it into some kind of change is a big challenge. And I spend a lot of my time working on this. Mike Migursky, who's back there, has been working with me on a bunch of things for years. He's now CTO for Code for America, but also has been working in crisis mapping and the street map and walking papers and a bunch of other libraries that everybody uses but may not realize. I'm going to pull up a little bit of a presentation on some of the things. I'm going to try not to, it's more along the lines of trying to inspire some conversations and brainstorms than to dive too deeply into all the problems. But let me start with one of the big challenges I see. We all like cool toys. We want to play with drones. We want to do new things with new sensors and carry our mobile phones around and do analyses off of chemical signatures from the multi-spec camera that we've attached to our Droid devices. It's great, and we collect a lot of new data. So this is a lot of the focus of the engineering challenge, but it doesn't always get us to what we need. If we're going to do work where we're beginning to think through the resilience, usually this type of sensor data gets into a map. We may make it three-dimensional, it may look incredibly pretty, but ultimately things still come down to a relatively simple equation. We need to know what the hazard is. Is it an earthquake? Is it a flood? And we need to be able to get some data on it. Our sensors are really helping us understand some of the invisible natures of the fault lines, the periods that happen between events. Like, is it a volcano with a 10,000-year cycle, an earthquake with a 1,000-year cycle? But until we have good exposure data, i.e., how do we know what the building's made out of, how big it is, how many stories is it, we can't do a whole lot of analysis.